This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals, the podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a book series focused on animal studies scholarship from a range of disciplinary perspectives. The most recent entry into the series was Animal Activism on and Off Screen, which was edited by Claire Parkinson and Lara Herring. I know lots of listeners are interested in questions about pro-animal messages in TV and film, so I encourage you to take a look at this book to see if it piques your interest. You can read the introduction for free on the Sydney University Press website. Now today we're going to touch on a topic that proves deeply controversial in many areas of academia. Listeners who know my work might be aware that I've written a bit about animals and the ethics of warfare. Elsewhere, I've said that war is terrible, and as animals are frequently overlooked victims of armed conflict, war is often even more terrible than many commentators realise. That's potentially true in any war, including the ongoing hostilities in Gaza. Today's guest is Dr Rimona Afana. Rimona is a Romanian-Palestinian academic, as well as an activist and multimedia artist. Her research addresses war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against nature, and crimes against non-human animals. Her research has taken her to various institutions, including Emory University School of Law and Kennesaw State University in the United States, where she was an assistant professor of peace studies. Among her other research projects, she's currently working on a book with the working title Ecocide/Speciesism, Rethinking Interdependence in the Anthropocene. Today, however, we're going to discuss her forthcoming paper, The Invisible Victims of Israel's Genocide/Ecocide on Gaza, Crimes Against Nature and Non-Human Animals, which was an invited contribution to the forthcoming Gruyter Handbook of Conflict Resolution and Peace. Welcome to the podcast, Rimona.
Thank you, Josh, for allowing me to share a bit about the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. I truly value your openness to discuss a topic many seem to be avoiding.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
First, because on my dad's side, our family is from and some still in Gaza. Most people in Gaza are actually not from there. They are Palestinians displaced in 1948 by Israel, whose lands and homes were stolen. That's what happened to my grandparents too. Palestinian people and lands have been crushed for nearly a century now, and the ongoing catastrophe in Gaza is only the culmination of a systematic incremental process. Not living in Gaza, I have the privilege to think and write about it, which many Palestinians do not because their life has been turned into a slow death. Second, because for the past 20 years, my studies, research, and activism have focused on crimes against humans and against non-humans in different sites. So the ongoing genocide and ecocide in Gaza matters to me personally and professionally. As you also pointed out, a war doesn't just harm humans. It also impacts non-human animals. It destroys plants and microorganisms, impacting ecosystems for decades or even centuries. However, these crimes remain outside mainstream news and studies. So for the past year and a half, I've been documenting the invisible victims of the war on Gaza, animals and nature.
Let's start with these invisible victims then. In what ways is the crisis in Gaza impacting animals?
The genocidal and ecocidal war on Gaza is impacting animals and nature in several ways. While I cannot cover all my findings today, I will just briefly introduce listeners to the areas I document in my paper. First, crimes against non-human animals. I show how hundreds of thousands to millions have been killed, injured, maimed, displaced, starved, or looted. Then I show how animals also became complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity. Specifically, we have reports of Israel weaponizing dogs to torture, terrorize, injure, or rape Palestinians. Next, I cover the massive toxicity from explosives and destroyed infrastructure, the severe damage to plants and soil, and the burden of greenhouse gas emissions. I also examine the lasting ties between mass atrocity and epigenetics, that is, the intergenerational impact of these crimes on humans, animals, and nature. Finally, I covered the role of the military-industrial complex, the merchants of death, driving both genocide and ecocide. And in the last part of my paper, I discussed the paralysis of international law when it comes to crimes against both humans and non-humans, and our role in confronting impunity and outsourcing, which are key features of crimes in Palestine. So let's start with a brief overview of the impact on animals. Just like humans, non-humans in Gaza have been suffering for now 682 days from murder, horrific injuries, untreated infections, chronic illnesses, dehydration, hunger, homelessness, and terror. The impact on sentient beings is immense. A recent report by Euromed Human Rights Monitor estimates about 97% of Gaza's animals have been killed by bombing, starved to death, or looted by July. Hundreds of thousands of animals have been killed, with an estimated 93% of poultry farms fully destroyed, 97% of cows, sheep, and goats, and 94% of donkeys, mules, and horses killed by bombing or starvation. And this reflects the deepening catastrophe documented by prior studies. For instance, last year, the Food and Agriculture Organization documented that by spring, 95% of Gaza's cattle had died, and fewer than 43% of sheep and 37% of goats were still alive. The worst affected was the poultry sector, with about just 1% of birds left alive. Animals used for recreation have also suffered. Nearly all zoos in Gaza have been destroyed, animals dying from bombardment, starvation, and lack of veterinary care. Also, by early 2024, reports by local journalists indicated that 90% of horses in Gaza's equestrian clubs had been killed, while the rest went missing. And it's important to note here that the assessments we have so far only include owned animals. So the number of impacted homeless domestic animals and of wild animals is difficult to approximate. And that's unsurprising. In many places, even in times of peace, no one keeps track of unowned animals. And that's a reminder of our objectifying reports to non-humans. While a precise overall toll is not available, my estimation is that millions of wild and domesticated animals in total have been killed, injured, maimed, displaced, starved, or looted. Many animals who survived bombing eventually died from starvation, dehydration, or untreated illnesses and injuries. We've also had heartbreaking reports of dogs eating the corpses of murdered Palestinians, or homeless cats and dogs and displaced children, all hungry, scavenging through trash. Also, last month, several platforms reported that dozens to hundreds of donkeys were stolen by the Israeli military under the guise of veterinary rescue, some taken to farms or sanctuaries in Israel, others taken abroad. Palestinians claim they were looted to prevent their use as primary mode of transport amid the genocide. Another form of harm I explore in my paper is animal captivity, a topic I've been writing on over the past years. While conventional sites of confinement such as factory farms, labs, zoos, aquaria, circuses, menageries, and so on are known and condemned, we also have atypical forms, and to me, captivity amid war is one of them. During war, animals often find themselves confined, restrained, or immobilized. In Gaza, many animals were trapped under the rubble. They were chained or tied, confined in cages, crates, stalls, and so on amid bombardment. So they found themselves unable to move, with their human caretakers dead, injured, or displaced, so no one there to release and care for them. Captivity amid war means a slow and painful death. Another particular sinister form of animal abuse is the weaponization of animals. Animals become complicit against their will in genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. We've had reports by locals and by human rights NGOs such as Euromed Human Rights Monitor that Israel is using military dogs to torture, terrorize, injure, and rape Palestinians, with multiple cases of dogs mauling Gazans, alive and dead, including women, children, and elderly. And that's not new. For decades, Israel has used military dogs to brutalize Palestinians in prisons or during home invasions, with hundreds of cases documented. An investigation by the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations indicates some of the dogs used for crimes in Gaza are imported from the Netherlands, from companies which have supplied the Israeli military for decades. And recently, this research center, alongside 9 other Palestinian and Dutch NGOs, have sued the Netherlands over its role in facilitating Israel's violations of international law. And significantly, one of the demands in the case is halting exports of military dogs. There's so much more I could share on how animals have suffered from the ongoing atrocities, but in the interest of time, I think I'll stop here.
Well, I'm sure we'll dig into further specifics as we continue our conversation. Let me ask some bigger picture questions which might then provoke some reflections on particular cases. So in the written paper, you frame this as work about Israel's military action, but presumably the military actions of Hamas also have a negative impact on animals.
Yes, I wouldn't call any military action animal-friendly, for sure. From what I know, Hamas's massacre has killed and injured a few companion animals in Israel, but there aren't any reports of a significant toll on animals and nature, so it's incomparable to Israel's total destruction of life in Gaza. And the context matters here. We shouldn't fall into any false equivalences or whataboutism when discussing Israel's atrocities. First, October 7 was one day, whereas Gazans have endured the genocide and ecocide for 682 days now. Second, the military capabilities of Hamas and Israel are incomparable. And third, October 7 happened in the context of decades of Israeli crimes which have crushed every human and non-human in Palestine. Although we're talking about animals in this podcast, I think the context is very significant because we have multiple intersecting layers of exceptional criminality which has endured for nearly a century. Palestinians' lives remain marked by settler extractive colonialism, which is the last active colonial project in the world. We have the longest illegal military occupation in modern times. We have decades of ethnic cleansing, widely documented apartheid practices, routine war crimes, crimes against humanity and human rights violations, a deliberately failed and failing peace process. We also have third-party complicity, and this includes the US's military and diplomatic role in sustaining Israel's crimes, as well as the UN's failure to challenge the crimes. And we also have the corporate profit derived from war occupation and annexation over the past decades. We also have here Israel's pervasive culture of complicity and denial. I've documented these enduring and intersecting factors in my writings and activism over the past 20 years, drawing on hundreds of academic studies, human rights reports, legal conventions, and many other sources. This context cannot be disputed by anyone with a sense of morality and some basic background in law. But returning to Hamas's actions, international law recognizes people's right to resistance, including military resistance against colonial, occupying, and racist regimes. So ethically and legally, Palestinians have the right to resist the crimes inflicted on them. Of course, it's not upon me to decide how they should resist. It's up to Palestinians in Palestine. I personally don't consider murder a solution, and the so-called Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and others have done little to benefit Palestinian people. But we need to remember that myriad forms of non-violent resistance have been attempted for decades by Palestinians and by their allies abroad, and they've been all systematically crushed by Israel. Everything Palestinians have tried has been brutally suppressed. So this is really not about just violent resistance. It's about any form of resistance. As animal rights scholars and activists, we should remember that even an animal, when repeatedly aggressed, displaced, confined, starved, terrorized, the animal will resist, violently or non-violently. So resisting violence and injustice is a natural reaction for any human and for many animals too. That is why some see October 7 as a natural reaction to a century of criminality endured by Palestinians. However, I believe anyone with a consistent sense of ethics and compassion cannot glorify the murder of any human or non-human, regardless of the context, whether we're talking about a colonial occupation army or whether it's a subjugated people and what some believe to be their resistance movement. We cannot cherish life along ethnic, national, or speciesist lines. Palestinian lives matter, Israeli lives matter, human lives matter, and animal lives matter. Sadly, many refuse to recognize that because people's morality and empathy are inconsistent, they are self-serving. We see people building careers of supposedly fighting injustice, human rights scholars and activists, but they have dead animals on their plate. Or we have animal rights activists who have fallen into deep misanthropy or indifference, who are no longer moved by human suffering. Or we have scholars and activists who simply refuse to talk about the genocide on Gaza, or others who refuse to understand the grief and horror left behind by Hamas's carnage on October 7. I believe that we are vessels for life. We don't give life, so we have no right to take life. Hamas's massacre has not just taken the lives of 1,200 Israelis, but it has also offered a very convenient excuse to the Israeli government to accelerate the genocidal agenda against Palestinians that's been ongoing for nearly a century. So while condemning the carnage on October 7, we need to acknowledge the century-long criminality against Palestinians, which is of exceptional gravity, legally and morally. And we also need to recognize that the ongoing atrocities in Gaza are only a natural continuation of a steady pattern of murder, displacement, and dispossession. We also need to acknowledge that the effects on both humans and non-humans are incomparable between Hamas's actions and Israel's.
This next question might very much move along the same sort of lines, but as you acknowledge, war is almost always incredibly bad for animals, and we know this from existing scholarship. What, if anything, makes this particular conflict distinctive in terms of its impact on animals?
This genocidal and ecocidal war on Gaza is different because of the apocalyptic proportions of its effects. Thousands of lawyers, scholars, UN officials, prominent Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations, Holocaust survivors, as well as humanitarian workers, physicians, and army veterans who've returned from Gaza have reached the same conclusion. This is genocide. And many insist it's not just genocide, but the worst humanitarian catastrophe they've ever witnessed, and the worst we've seen globally over the past decades. Worse than Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Sudan. The criminality and suffering have reached truly apocalyptic proportions. Fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, such as distinction, proportionality, necessity, humanity, have been brutally violated in Israel's operations, crushing both humans and non-humans. The housing, medical, sanitation, and food infrastructure have been destroyed, creating a horrific humanitarian crisis with millions of people and animals homeless, humans and non-humans starving to death every day, children's limbs amputated without anesthetic, and millions of cases of infectious diseases. For listeners to get a sense of the scale of the destruction, from October 2023 to early April 2024, Israel had dropped over 75,000 tons of explosives on Gaza, the equivalent of 6 nuclear bombs. By July this year, over 125,000 tons of explosives have been used. And some experts say that the explosives dropped on Gaza exceed the World War II bombings in Dresden, Hamburg, and London combined. By July, according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, 92% of housing units, 88% of entities in commerce and industry, and 81% of primary, secondary, and tertiary roads in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. So almost everyone there is displaced. Also, significant amounts of hazardous substances from destroyed infrastructure and from munitions have contaminated the entire Gaza Strip, harming humans and animals and microorganisms for generations. Between 70 to 90% of tree crop fields in Gaza are lost from bombardment and ground operations. Over 86% of cropland, 83% of agricultural wells, and 71% of greenhouses have been damaged or destroyed. Now we only have 1.5% of cropland available for cultivation. This affects both humans' ability to feed themselves and to feed domestic animals, and it also impacts wild animals who have lost their homes. For instance, the 250 bird species in Gaza who needed those trees. We also have massive air, land, and water pollution. We have a severe famine and lack of clean water affecting every human and animal in Gaza. When it comes to air pollution, a study by Nymark and colleagues showed the projected carbon dioxide emissions from war, pre-war, and post-war activities surpassed individual annual emissions of over 102 countries. When it comes to deaths and injuries, though the human death toll is now about 62,000, multiple studies have shown that if we include indirect deaths from the genocidal conditions imposed on Gaza, the death toll is probably closer to 200,000. Many others have been injured and maimed. Hundreds of thousands to millions of animals have been killed, injured, displaced, or starved to death. And what's next? UN reports show that it may take 80 years to rebuild Gaza, and that only removing the over 50 million tons of debris could take up to 20 years. Another UN report notes that once a ceasefire is reached, it would take Gaza 350 years just to restore its GDP to 2022 level. Exceptional are not just the massive destruction and suffering, but also the extent of complicity. In spite of the unprecedented global recognition of these crimes, Israel continues unabated. Foreign governments continue aiding and abetting genocide. International fora supposedly in charge of peace and justice are in paralysis, and corporations continue profiting of atrocities. What is different here is also the long-term impact, the fact that this genocidal and ecocidal war has not just displaced, killed, injured so many humans and animals, but it has turned Gaza into a toxic wasteland which can no longer sustain life. Still, we also have this intergenerational component here. And also particular about current atrocities is that they come in a context of exceptional prior criminality by Israel, including its settler extractive colonial enterprise, its illegal military occupation, its deeply entrenched apartheid, its decades-long ethnic cleansing. So we have here genocide, we have ecocide, we have myriad war crimes, we have crimes against humanity, human rights violations, apartheid, and so on. And these are not just slogans. These are realities which have broken the lives of millions of Palestinians for decades, documented by leading legal experts. When the context is so catastrophic for humans, animals will of course suffer too, because they share the same stolen, fragmented, and poisoned space as humans. And many animals rely on humans for care. But humans in Gaza are now dead or on the brink of death.
You talk about these international organisations, you talk about reports. We know already from existing scholarship on animals and war that understanding the impact of war on animals in the midst of the so-called fog of war is always an enormous challenge. And this presumably is particularly true in the current case, as we know that Israel bans international journalists and academics from accessing Gaza. So how do we as academics know what the impact on animals is like in Gaza?
Yes, Gaza is, as sociologist Baruch Kimmerling called it 20 years ago, the world's largest concentration camp. Because of the draconian blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt for the past 18 years, combined with constant genocidal assaults every few months for decades now, It's very difficult to get in, even for those with family there. And if that was the case before this genocidal war, now the situation is catastrophic. Israel has indeed banned international journalists in Gaza to prevent the documentation of the atrocities. In addition, over the past 22 months, Israel has killed more journalists in Gaza than in any other war over the past 200 years. Brown University's Costs of War project shows more journalists have been murdered in Gaza than in World War I and II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Yugoslav wars, the US Civil War, and Afghanistan combined. Media offices in Gaza have been bombed, and many journalists have been assassinated while at work or at home. Multiple sources indicate that over the past 22 months, Israel has killed around 270 journalists and other media workers, almost all of them Palestinian. So nearly all journalists in Gaza have been murdered. And this is not new, it's just a massive intensification of violence against Palestinian journalists, which has been routine in both Gaza and the West Bank over the past decades. As I also acknowledge in my paper, the situation is volatile and many details are imprecise or not yet available given the relentless murder of locals and of journalists, the severe internet and electricity cuts and other factors which hinder reporting. So the crimes documented in my paper are only a fraction of the ongoing horrors. However, in spite of the suppression of witnessing and reporting, I believe there is no fog of war here. This is in fact the best documented genocide in history. It's a live stream genocide where every day for 22 months now, we've seen thousands of horrific photos and videos of the atrocities and endless testimonies of Palestinian survivors and of foreign doctors, humanitarian workers, military personnel, and others who have returned from Gaza. Since conditions there hinder traditional reporting, we've had a significant rise in citizen journalism over the past decade. We've seen a massive rise in Palestinian voices reporting on their social media and being featured on international news platforms. We also have local and international human rights NGOs and UN agencies documenting the crimes. The near total devastation of Gaza is also documented by researchers through remote sensing imagery, particularly satellite imagery. Returning to your question, how do we know what's going on with animals in particular? As mentioned before, the numbers I've come across only cover owned animals. So the impact on homeless domestic animals and wild animals is difficult to approximate. But while a precise overall toll is not available, my estimation is that millions of wild and domestic animals have been killed, injured, maimed, displaced, or starved. And that is because when it comes to owned animals, the majority, that is hundreds of thousands, had already been killed by bombs, starvation, or untreated injuries, illnesses, and infections by early 2025. So if adding to owned animals, also all unowned, domesticated, and all wild animals impacted, the total surely rises to millions of individuals. And as you also write, Josh, in your article on counting animals in war, and as others have noted too, keeping track of non-human victims is definitely not an easy task, but it's a necessary one. Otherwise, the full impact of atrocities remains partial and misleading. We can't just look at human victims and destroyed infrastructure.
Now, we know that no country, in legal terms, seriously recognises animal rights. But we sometimes see in this world, in this activist world, in this academic world, we sometimes see Israel described as a comparatively animal-friendly country. So, for example, it has a high vegan population, and that includes a high proportion of vegans in the military. So, with that in mind, is the Israeli government or Israeli population or Israeli military taking any steps to limit the impact of this war on animals?
So for a decade now, scholars and activists have referred to that as vegan washing. Vegan washing is obfuscating Israel's crimes through portrayals of a supposedly animal-friendly, compassionate society. And I address that in my paper. Many Israelis seem to experience a sinister decoupling of human rights from non-human rights. So it's not just Israeli human rights valued over Palestinian human rights, but we also see animal rights valued over human rights. And Israel is indeed one of the world's vegan capitals with a growing animal rights movement. That creates a veneer of ethics and compassion. But some of the same Israelis prizing animal rights have little empathy for Palestinian humans and non-humans who are blown to pieces or starved to death. So we have here two inconsistent yet interlocked processes. On the one hand, we see the dehumanization and the animalization of humans. Palestinians are referred to and treated as animals. For instance, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant in famous quote, "We are fighting against human animals," a sentiment shared by many Israeli politicians, military leaders, lawmakers, and ordinary people. But on the other hand, we see the humanization of non-humans. I've personally witnessed over the years many Israelis treating their companion animals like humans, better treatment than they would ever extend to Palestinians. So back to your question whether the Israeli government and military are taking steps to limit the impact of the war on animals, there is no evidence of anything significant being done to prevent or stop the atrocities or to repair them. The catastrophic effects on humans, non-humans, and nature speak for themselves. Of course, there are Israelis who oppose their government's crimes, including some of my close friends, whose compassion and integrity I admire, but sadly, they are just a minority.
One thing you discussed in your paper that academics who explore animals and warfare perhaps haven't talked about as much as they could is the potential for war to lead to intergenerational harms to animals. Could you introduce us to this idea?
One section of my paper covers mass atrocity and epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of changes in gene expression that occur without altering the underlying DNA sequence. And numerous studies document epigenetic alterations in individuals exposed to chronic stressors, such as psychological trauma, exposure to toxic substances, impoverished diets, extreme heat or cold, and many other factors. And significantly, some of these epigenetic changes can be transmitted inter- and transgenerationally. Basically, the body and mind start working differently, sometimes dysfunctionally, when exposed to significant persistent stressors, and future generations can inherit some of these dysfunctions. I introduce epigenetics in my discussion because mass atrocities like those in Gaza break human and non-human lives for generations. Those here and now left in the abyss are not the only victims. Future generations of humans and non-humans will face the many long-term consequences of this genocidal and ecocidal war. I believe the horrific crimes we're seeing now are likely to cause epigenetic changes in humans, animals, plants, and possibly microorganisms, all shook by the massive trauma and toxicity. The long-lasting psychological and physical effects of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity have been covered in the vast literature on intergenerational trauma. Also, many epigenetic changes caused by chronic stressors have been documented in non-human animals. However, the intergenerational impact of mass atrocity on animals, plants, and ecosystems is not well understood. And this is an area scientists will hopefully explore over the next years and decades. Because given the colossal scale of suffering, destruction, and toxicity, I cannot see any return to pre-war normality, to call it so. I believe that all beings in Gaza might develop epigenetic changes in response to the harm experienced, and these alterations will shape and misshape their life for decades.
How, if at all, can those of us outside of Gaza help the animals of Gaza?
Honestly, I don't know. One's first instinct would be to donate to charities supposedly offering food, shelter, and veterinary care to animals. But given Israel's blocking of humanitarian aid and constant bombardment, one can never be sure if anything is reaching the animals. If you look up online fundraisers for animals in Gaza, you'll come across various initiatives by organizations and individuals, local and international. but I cannot endorse any because I don't know enough about their grassroots impact. There's, for instance, Sulala Animal Rescue, the only rescue in Gaza, but they only take care of homeless cats, dogs, and a few other animals, so it's insignificant when compared to the totality of animals impacted. And we need to remember that even humans are relentlessly murdered. They are homeless, starving, they are severely injured, and the few remaining medical professionals cannot keep up with the casualties. And it's the same with animals. They have no access to food and water, they have no shelter. Many vet clinics have been destroyed, and many vets have been murdered, injured, or displaced. So what can be done for animals is, of course, even less than what we can do to help humans, because they are way lower on conventional hierarchies of victimhood. Whatever we do is probably just a band-aid, given the ongoing nature of the genocidal and ecocidal operations. You can feed a few animals today, but tomorrow they will get blown to pieces by another Israeli bomb. Every aspect of life in Gaza has collapsed, so I'm not sure what can still be done. But what we all can and must do is to continue raising awareness about the atrocities, which will hopefully translate sooner than later into enough global pressure for these crimes to end. So talk about the atrocities with family, friends, colleagues at work, donate to grassroots projects you trust, go to protests, sign petitions, and also confront the silence of both human rights and animal rights NGOs on the catastrophe endured by humans and non-humans in Gaza for nearly 2 years now, and for many preceding decades.
The last thing I want to do is stop that conversation, but we have limited time on this podcast, and one of the things we always like to do is ask regular questions to get a sense of the shape of animal studies, the influences of animal studies, how animal studies has developed. So Rimona, are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I got to animal rights as an extension of my work on human rights, war crimes and crimes against humanity. I suddenly had the epiphany, a pretty late epiphany, that you can't truly care about some lives while harming and excluding others. Reading Richard Falk's and Polly Higgins's work on Ecocide made me think of non-human rights. And from that, I slowly transitioned to animal rights, reading Richard Gruyter, Steve Saponsis, Stephen Wise, Piers Byrne, and others.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
First was a paper in which I explored the ties between ecocide and speciesism, followed by an article where I showed why industrial animal farming and wildlife trade should be treated as a continuum between genocide and ecocide, and not as normal, legal, necessary sectors. So both pretty aspirationally.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Different scholars and activists inform and inspire me in different ways. I can't name one in particular.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Significant for scholars, activists, and everyone else is to maybe question their everyday ethics. Many invisible factors shape or misshape morality and compassion, whether in our relations to humans or with non-humans.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would reverse roles for a few days. I would make humans experience the everydayness of a confined and tortured animal. That might change a few things about our beliefs and habits.
What are you working on next?
I'm slowly progressing with a bunch of different projects. One is a paper I wrote 1 year ago, which I'm expanding into a book. It documents the many crimes against the dead and the unborn in Gaza. Another paper I'm revising these days is on well-meaning captivity, looking at harms experienced by animals trapped in shelters and sanctuaries in Romania, and working on 3 new research projects. One examines ethical, legal, and biological aspects surrounding the necessity or avoidability of animal suffering. The second is on civic and legal initiatives against weapons corporations whose products drive both genocide and ecocide. And the third is on temporal torture in Palestine, stealing time, robbing chunks of one's life as a form of torture, a reality for all Palestinians.
How can people find out more about your work?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook, where I often post about my work and how many aspects of my personal life intersect with my work. I also post on Facebook on the Ecocide Speciesism page, a project I created years ago. My paper on the topic explored today is not yet published, but those keen on reading it can message me and I would gladly send it to you.
Well, thanks so much, Rimona, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks for having me, Josh, and thanking listeners for caring about the human and non-human victims of the atrocities in Gaza.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and I'm on X, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Blue Sky. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.